All right, everybody, welcome to another deep dive. And today we're tackling something that I think a lot of people find really challenging when they're learning English,
Oh, yeah.
and that is pronunciation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, it can be a really frustrating thing because, like, you can learn all the grammar, you can learn all the vocabulary,
Right.
but then if you can't actually say the words properly,
You're not understood.
it's like, what's the point, right?
Exactly. And it's not just about being understood. It's also about feeling confident when you speak.
Yeah,
If you're constantly worried about how you sound, it can really hold you back.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there, kind of feeling self-conscious or hesitant to speak up because we're not sure if we're saying things correctly.
Yeah.
So we're really excited to dive into this topic today, and we're actually going to be using a script from Podcast Listen and Learn English as our guide.
Great resource.
Yeah, they got some really great tips and insights that we want to share with you all.
Yeah, they really break things down in a way that's easy to understand, and they give you practical advice that you can actually use.
Yeah, so let's start with the basics. Why is pronunciation so important?
Well, I think we've touched on it a little bit already, but good pronunciation is really the foundation of effective communication.
Right.
If people can't understand what you're saying, it doesn't matter how interesting your ideas are or how much vocabulary,
Yeah,
you know.
it's like you're speaking a different language almost.
Exactly. I've had my own share of pronunciation mishaps over the years. One time I was traveling in Italy and I was trying to order a cappuccino,
Okay.
but I accidentally pronounced it cappuccino with the stress on the wrong syllable.
Oh, no.
And the barista looked at me like I was crazy. He had no idea what I was talking about.
So you ended up with something completely different.
I ended up with an espresso, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't what I wanted.
Not quite the same.
Not quite the same. So yeah, pronunciation really does matter.
It makes a difference, and it can lead to some funny situations sometimes.
It can.
So, okay, let's talk about some of the specific areas that English learners often struggle with. Um, Podcast, Listen, and Learn English highlights a few key ones, and I think one of the biggest ones is vowel sounds.
Oh yeah, those vowels. They can be tricky.
They're so subtle.
There are so many of them, and the differences between them can be so small.
Right, and I think one of the things that Podcast, Listen, and Learn English points out is that it's not just about memorizing the sounds, it's about understanding how the sounds are produced in your mouth.
Absolutely. It's about the physicality of it.
Sure.
Where's your tongue? Where are your lips? What's the shape of your mouth? All of that plays a role.
So it's like you're almost like an athlete training your mouth to do these new things.
Exactly. It's a workout for your mouth.
And they give the classic example of ship versus sheep,
Right.
which I know every English learner has heard a million times.
Oh, yeah.
But they actually break it down in a really interesting way. They talk about how, for ship, your tongue is high and forward in your mouth. Your lips are slightly spread, and the sound is short and clipped.
Yeah.
But for sheep, your tongue is lower and flatter. Your lips are more relaxed, and the sound is longer and more drawn out.
Exactly.
So it's really about those subtle differences in tongue position and lip shape.
It is. And once you start paying attention to those things, you start to hear the difference more clearly.
Right.
And you can start to feel the difference in your own mouth when you're producing the sounds.
So it becomes less about just mimicking and more about understanding the mechanics of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so vowel sound, and that's a big one. What about those silent letters that English is famous for?
Those silent letters. Yeah. Podcasts Listen and Learn English talks about those too. And they give some great examples like knife and honest.
Yeah, those are classic ones.
Yeah. And what's interesting about silent letters is that they often reflect the history of the language.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Like, for example, the K in knife. It used to be pronounced, back in Old English, but over time the pronunciation changed, but the spelling stayed the same.
So like a little fossil.
It is. It's a linguistic fossil.
That's so fascinating.
And understanding that historical context can actually make those spellings a little bit easier to remember.
Yeah, because you've got like a story behind it.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, another area that I know a lot of learners struggle with is stress and intonation.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And Podcast Listen and Learn English talks about how putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable can completely change the meaning of a word.
Absolutely can. And they give the classic example of record.
Oh, yeah.
Which can be a noun or a verb depending on where you put the stress.
Right. So record the noun.
Yeah.
Record the verb.
Exactly.
Simple word, but completely different meaning.
Completely different meaning. And, it's not just about individual words either. It's about the overall rhythm and melody of the language.
Right. It's like the music of English.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked about some of the major pitfalls. Now let's get to the good stuff. The actual tips for improvement.
All right, let's do it.
What are some of the key takeaways from Podcast Listen and Learn English?
Well, I think one of the biggest things they emphasize is the importance of active listening and imitation.
Okay, so it's not just about passively listening to English. It's about really paying attention.
Exactly. It's about tuning into the sounds, focusing on how native speakers are pronouncing words, how they're using intonation, and then trying to replicate that yourself.
So it's almost like you're a detective, kind of analyzing the sounds.
You're a pronunciation detective.
I like that. And they recommend immersing yourself in authentic English content as much as possible.
Right. Movies, TV shows, podcasts, anything you enjoy.
But the key is to really pay attention to the pronunciation.
Exactly. Don't just have it on in the background. Really listen to how the words are being spoken.
Okay, so that's active listening. What about imitation?
So imitation is all about trying to copy what you hear. Trying to match the sounds, the rhythm, the intonation as closely as possible.
Okay, and I guess the more you do that, the more natural it'll become.
Exactly. It's like anything else. The more you practice, the better you get.
Okay, so active listening and imitation, that's a big one. What else?
Well, another great tip they give is to practice with minimal pairs.
Minimal pairs, what are those?
So minimal pairs are words that differ by just one sound, like cat and cut, or bed and bad. And by focusing on those tiny differences, you can really train your ear and your mouth to hear and produce those sounds accurately.
Like a targeted workout for your pronunciation.
Exactly. It's a very specific type of practice that can be really effective.
Okay, I like that. Now, this next one, I have to admit, makes me a little bit nervous.
What's that?
Recording yourself.
Oh, yeah?
But I know Podcast Listen and Learn English really emphasizes how valuable it can be.
It can be a little scary.
Yeah.
But it's so helpful because we often don't hear ourselves the way other people hear us. So by recording yourself speaking English, you can really get a sense of where your pronunciation might be off.
It's like holding up a mirror to your pronunciation.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just use your phone or your computer to record yourself reading a short paragraph or having a conversation with someone.
Okay. And then I guess just listen back can be really critical.
Yeah, listen back and see if you can identify any areas where your pronunciation could be clearer or more accurate.
Okay. I'm going to try that. I'm going to be brave.
Good.
All right. Let's move on to something that I think a lot of learners find really intimidating, and that's phonetics.
Yeah, phonetics, it can seem kind of scary.
It does. Whenever I hear the word phonetics, my brain kind of shuts down.
I know it can feel very technical, but Podcast Listen and Learn English actually does a really good job of demystifying it.
Okay, good.
They explain that phonetics is simply about understanding the building blocks of sound.
Okay.
How sounds are produced in your mouth, how they're classified, and how they're represented visually.
Okay, so it's not about like memorizing complicated formulas or anything.
No, it's more about getting a clearer picture of how sounds work.
Okay. That makes it seem a lot less intimidating.
Yeah, and they introduce the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, as a helpful tool.
The IPA now, is that something that we should all be familiar with?
It's not essential, but it can be really useful, especially if you're serious about mastering English pronunciation.
Okay.
It's basically a system of symbols that represents every sound in the language, so you can look up a word in the dictionary and know exactly how it should be pronounced.
So it's like a pronunciation decoder ring.
Exactly. It takes the guesswork out of it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think I might need to look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's worth checking out.
Okay, I think we have time for one more tip before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay, what's the last one?
This was all about having fun while you practice.
Oh, fun. I like that.
Tongue twisters.
Tongue twisters, yes. Those are great.
They're so challenging, but so satisfying when you finally get them right.
They are, and they're really good for improving your articulation and getting those tricky sound combinations to flow more smoothly.
Yeah, and Podcast Listen and Learn English actually gives a few examples. One of them is the classic, "She sells seashells by the seashore."
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I feel like everyone knows that one.
Everyone knows that one.
But it's still a good one to practice.
It is, and what's great about tongue twisters is that you can practice them anywhere, anytime.
Right.
You're waiting for the bus, you're in the shower, you can just practice your tongue twisters.
Just get those sounds out there.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our pronunciation journey.
Yeah, we have.
We've explored some of the common pitfalls, delved into the why behind them, and uncovered some fantastic tips from Podcast Listen and Learn English. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that pronunciation is not just about mimicking sounds, it's about understanding how those sounds are produced and using that knowledge to fine-tune our own speech.
It's like we were saying before, it's about that mind-body connection.
Exactly.
And I think Podcast Listen and Learn English does a brilliant job of breaking it down in a way that's both insightful and accessible.
Yeah, they really do.
So I'm feeling really motivated to keep working on my pronunciation.
Me too.
And I hope you all are too.
Yeah.
And be sure to stick around for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring even more tips and strategies from Podcast Listen and Learn English.
We'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome back, everyone.
All right, so we're back, and we're continuing our deep dive into the world of English pronunciation.
Yeah, and I think we left off talking about how important it is to actively listen and imitate when you're learning pronunciation.
Right, like really paying attention to how native speakers are saying things.
Exactly. And one thing that Podcast Listen and Learn English really emphasizes is the importance of finding opportunities to actually practice speaking with other people.
Yeah, like getting out there and using your pronunciation skills in real-life conversations.
Right, because it's one thing to practice on your own,
Yeah.
but it's a whole other thing to actually put it into practice in a real-life setting.
It's like taking those pronunciation muscles to the gym.
Exactly.
You know, you got to get them working.
You got to use them.
Yeah. And they even suggest joining online language exchange groups or finding conversation partners through apps or websites.
Yeah, those can be great resources.
Yeah, I've actually had some really good experiences with language exchange myself.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how much you can learn from each other.
Even if you're both still learning.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a really fun way to practice.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so practice speaking with others. That's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
What else did Podcast Listen and Learn English recommend?
Well, they also talk about the importance of patience and persistence.
Oh, yeah, that's key with anything, really.
It's so easy to get discouraged when you're learning something new, especially something like pronunciation, which can be so subtle and challenging.
Yeah. Right. And it's easy to feel like you're not making progress.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that it takes time
But
and effort.
and everyone learns at their own pace.
Exactly.
Right.
So be patient with yourself and don't give up.
Yeah. And celebrate those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. Like when you finally nail that tricky sound.
Yeah. Or when you have a conversation and someone understands you perfectly.
Yes. Those are the moments to celebrate.
Okay. So patience, persistence, those are important. Podcast Listen and Learn English also talked about the connection between pronunciation and overall confidence in speaking English.
Right. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it makes sense when you feel good about how you sound.
Yeah.
You're more likely to speak up and participate in conversations.
You are. And you're less likely to feel self-conscious or hold back.
Right, so it's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. The better your pronunciation gets, the more confident you feel. And the more confident you feel, the better your pronunciation gets.
Yeah, I like that.
And, improved pronunciation can also have a positive impact on other areas of your life.
Oh yeah, like how?
Well, for example, if you're applying for a job or giving a presentation,
Right.
having clear and confident pronunciation can really make a difference.
Makes you seem more professional and credible.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it can also help you build stronger relationships with people.
Absolutely, because when you can communicate effectively, it's easier to connect with others.
Right, it breaks down those barriers.
It does.
Okay, so pronunciation is important for confidence, for professional success, for building relationships.
It really is a fundamental skill.
Yeah, and I think Podcast Listen and Learn English does a great job of highlighting that.
They do. They
Wow.
really emphasize the importance of making pronunciation a priority.
Right, and not just treating it as an afterthought.
Exactly, because it's not something that you can just pick up along the way.
Right, you have to actively work on it.
You do.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different aspects of pronunciation so far. But I want to go back to something that we touched on earlier, and that's the idea of listening and imitating.
Okay.
Because I think that's really the foundation of everything.
It is. It's the core practice that you can do every day.
Right, so even if we're working on specific sounds or practicing with minimal pairs,
Yeah,
we should always be making time for listening and imitating native speakers.
absolutely. It's about developing that ear for the sounds of English
Right.
and internalizing those patterns.
Yeah, and the more you listen, the more you'll start to notice those nuances.
Exactly. And the more natural your own pronunciation will become.
So what are some good ways to practice listening and imitation?
Well, Podcast Listen and Learn English recommends watching movies and TV shows,
Okay.
listening to podcasts,
Yeah.
And even just paying attention to how people speak in everyday conversations.
Right, like eavesdropping on people's conversations.
Well, not exactly eavesdropping, but just being more aware of the sounds around you.
Right. Okay.
And the key is to really actively listen,
Yeah.
not just have it on in the background.
Don't just zone out.
Right, exactly.
Really pay attention.
Yeah. They suggest choosing a short segment of audio or video,
Okay.
listening to it carefully multiple times,
Okay.
and then trying to imitate the speaker as closely as possible.
So like really mimicking their pronunciation, their
Yes.
rhythm, their intonation.
Exactly. And it's okay if you don't get it perfect at first.
Right.
Just keep practicing and you'll gradually get better.
Okay, so find some authentic English content that you enjoy
Yeah,
and really listen and imitate.
exactly.
Okay, I like that. Before we move on to part 3, is there anything else that you want to add about listening and imitation?
Well, just that it's a skill that develops over time with consistent practice.
Okay.
So don't get discouraged if you don't see results immediately.
Oh, just keep at it.
Yeah, just keep practicing and you will improve.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the importance of practice, patience, confidence, and of course, listening and imitating.
We did.
And we've got even more great tips and strategies coming up in part 3.
We do. Stay tuned.
We'll be right back. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our pronunciation deep dive. And I'm excited to really get into the nitty-gritty of those tricky sounds that English is so famous for.
Yeah, podcast Listen and Learn English does not hold back. They really get into the details.
They do, and they give some great advice for tackling those sounds head on. So where should we start?
Well, I think we should revisit vowel sounds because they can be really tricky for learners, especially if those sounds don't exist in their native language.
Yeah, and I remember podcast Listen and Learn English emphasizing how important it is to understand the difference between short and long vowels.
Right, they use the ship versus sheep example again.
Yeah.
They go even deeper this time, talking about how the shape of your mouth and the tension in your lips also affect the sound.
It's like your whole mouth has to work together to create those sounds.
Exactly, it's an orchestra of muscles.
I love that. Okay, so vowels. What about those consonant clusters that can really trip people up?
Oh yeah, those can be tough, like the strar combination in words like street or strong.
Yeah, those are tongue twisters in themselves.
They are, but Podcast Listen and Learn English has a great tip practicing the individual sounds separately first and then slowly blend them together.
So it's like breaking down the movement into smaller steps.
Exactly. And they also suggest listening carefully to the target sound, even exaggerating it a bit at first to really get a feel for it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm ready for the big one, the T sounds.
Ah, yes, the infamous T sounds. Those are notoriously difficult for non-native speakers.
Because they just don't exist in a lot of other languages.
Right, but Podcast Listen and Learn English gives some really good advice. They explain that the key is to position your tongue correctly lightly between your teeth for the voiced the as in this or that, and behind your teeth for the unvoiced the as in think or think.
And they even suggest practicing in front of a mirror so you can see what your tongue is doing.
It might feel silly, but it really helps.
Yeah, okay, so tongue placement is key. What else?
Well, they also emphasize the importance of airflow, making sure you're exhaling gently as you produce the sound.
Breath control for pronunciation. Who knew?
It's all connected.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered some of the trickiest sounds in English, but I know there are a lot more out there.
There are, but I think the tips we've discussed can be applied to a wide range of sounds.
Right, it's about understanding the mechanics of how sounds are produced and then practicing those movements.
Exactly. And one more thing I wanted to mention from podcast Listen and Learn English is that they really encourage learners to be kind to themselves.
Oh, yeah, that's so important.
It is, because it's easy to get frustrated when you're working on pronunciation.
It can feel like you're not making progress.
Right, but it's crucial to remember that everyone learns at their own pace.
And that mistakes are part of the process.
Exactly. So celebrate those small victories and don't give up.
Yeah, you'll get there eventually.
You will.
So I think that's a great message to end on. Be patient, be persistent, and be kind to yourself.
Absolutely. And remember that pronunciation is a journey, not a destination.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly.
Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of English pronunciation, thanks to Podcast Listen and Learn English for all the great tips and insights.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
And for all of you listening out there, we hope you found this helpful, and we encourage you to keep practicing and keep exploring.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to check out Podcast Listen and Learn English for even more amazing resources.
And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and tell a friend about the show.
We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.